Hi everybody, this is my take number 5. I hope this is going to be the last one. I've never done anything like this before, so here goes. Today I'll be talking to you about whiteness, and I'll be doing some intersectionality deconstruction and explanation based on 3 or 4 levels of analysis, which includes gender, race, geographic location, um, and class. So I'm going to first define for you what whiteness is, at least what it is for me. And whiteness is a system of domination. And as George Day says, and I think you read that article that I gave you, George Day says whiteness scripts the lives of racialized and minoritized people, and basically puts them in positions of uh, a lack of power. And when your life is scripted by whiteness, it determines your areas of accessibility. So where and how you access resources and institutions. And it also determines how people see you and how your body is read. Frantz Fanon talks about how bodies are read based on race, and so this is what whiteness perpetuates. Whiteness is seen as normal, and it's also invisible to most people, particularly the people who privilege the most from it, that those being white people. Whiteness is persistent, and it occurs systemically. It occurs both systemically and at institutional levels. So you can see the pervasiveness of whiteness and how inserts itself, or we allow it to be inserted into all parts of our social institutions, legal institutions, and so on and so forth. Whiteness can be deployed intentionally or unintentionally, um, and indirectly by by individuals. It's also flexible and changeable, so the shape of whiteness will look different depend on the situation and depend on um, where you're located geographically, and it also depends on what is happening in the moment in time. I'll explain some of that as I go by. And Frankenberg, which you read this week, talks about how whiteness is always in a state of being undressed, where it's being unmasked, and how it needs to uncloak and remake itself continually in order to maintain the status quo. Um, and as you know, because we've had some of these discussion already, whiteness is used to preserve the status quo, which benefits a very minority of people. So I'm going to go on now to just talk a little bit about um, how whiteness is embedded in different parts of society, and for our purpose, I'm going to ask you to take a look at, I have a few videos, probably 2 or 3 videos accompanying this lecture. I'm going to ask you to take a look at the video by Tim Wise that talks about whiteness and the invention of whiteness, and that's very similar to what George Day calls whiteness is an invention of Western civilization. And Tim Wise talks about, and not only Tim Wise, obviously, many social activists and advocates talk about whiteness, its perpetuation, its invention, and how generally, really, how whiteness came about in order um, to put white people in positions of power, even those that were generally poor or considered underclass um, in days gone by. So you were asked to read I think 3 or 4 pieces of literature this week. I'm not going to speak specifically to any one of them, but what I'm going to talk about is how the literature relates to issues of whiteness. So let's first talk about power and privilege. So whiteness comes with power and privilege. Um, it's just a given. And what we need to always remember is that whiteness stays in place because of the pockets of power and privilege that people have, and those that have it and that are in power ensures that it stays in place so that those that do not have it also stay in place, if you understand what I mean. But when we talk about power and privilege, we need to remember that it's not a straightforward. Power is not straightforward. It's not something like that's inflexible. Everyone has pockets of power in different parts in their lives, and we have varying degrees of power, and that depends on where we are personally in our lives. That depends on our age or race or health status, um, or education, the place in the world that we live, and those kinds of things. Um, and many people are disempowered. Even those with a lot of power are also disempowered in some instances in their lives. So if we take someone that is very middle class, and has, good employment, has good housing, but lives with some form of a disability, let's say the person is wheelchair bound, or the person has mental health concerns, we can see how they can feel empowered or they can be disempowered in different kinds of ways. So going into uh, um, a hospital or an institution to receive care, for example, and if you're wheelchair bound, maybe the access is poor, or if you're needing to get some form of medication, that people who need to get psychiatrized, who are treated in a psychiatrized manner, are also treated discriminately in a number of ways. The thing to remember, though, is all those pieces depend as well on your class, your race, the parts of the world you live in, so on and so forth. So someone um, in Sierra Leone, for example, who is wheelchair bound or who lives with a physical disability is going to have a different experience, especially if they're poor, than someone who lives even in rural Newfoundland. Because people in rural Newfoundland are supported by the government and they have access to health care through telehealth, for example. And even if they live in those isolated areas, they're provided with healthcare in specific ways, so the government will pay for them to come inside the city to receive medical care. Now, the drawback is it might take them 6 hours to drive from home one way, or it might cost them a lot of money, but same, the idea is they still have access, whereas someone in a different part of the world may not have those access. Um, so as I mentioned before, power is linked to power. I might not have mentioned that. Power is linked to power relations, and these are linked to obvious and various social identity markers, such as your gender, as I mentioned before, your health status, where you live, and so on and so forth, sexual identification, race, age, for example. These identity markers are important to note because they will actually help you access resources, or they will bar you from accessing resources. And they'll also bar you from accessing the political system or contributing socially to your environment. So you might not be able to contribute in the way that you would like to contribute. The other thing to remember is those with more pockets of power generally dominate those with less pockets of power, and obviously these ideas and perceptions are seen as the norm. So they're embedded in society and they become the natural order of things. Those are things to remember as we go through as you go through what I'm recording here for you, and to keep in mind when you have your discussions tomorrow. It's going to be really exciting. Um, Inside the structure of power and privilege, there are rules and regulations. So the entities or the individuals or the groups that have the power, they tend to ensure that they institute their own ways of thinking and their own ways of being, and this helps to maintain the system of domination. So, for example, this is the simplistic way of thinking about it, is that social workers have their own language inside inside the profession. Every profession, the legal profession, the medical profession, or the healthcare profession, uh, um, nurses, they're part of healthcare, social workers, other professions have coded language. So when, as social workers, we talk about social justice and anti-oppression training or anti-oppressive social work practice, those are code words. If you worked as a nurse, maybe, they have discussions around, I don't know, I would say dendrites, or, when the body breaks down in a particular kind of way. And in the legal profession, they have, other terminologies. So people within these professions, they are able to communicate in a particular kind of way. If you consider whiteness in the same way, there are language inside of whiteness that ensures that the insiders or the people with the power know how to communicate in that language, and people outside of that generally don't understand how to communicate um, effectively. So they're barred outside forever. So I call it coded language. So if you consider the language in universities, for example, and as I mentioned, other professions, the thing to remember is any attempt by the people that are less dominant or are treated inferiorly to challenge or oppose the systems of domination or the status quo, any attempt is met with resistance, and quite often people are scapegoated and um, uh, and punished in different kinds of ways. So there's always a level of suspicion around people who do not adhere to the status quo, and they're called, in some cases, special interest groups. They're called radicals and other kinds of names. I don't know if you can think of some names that people are sometimes called when they try to challenge the system. Some of the forms of punishment might be scapegoating indirectly or directly, and it might also mean imprisonment. It might mean being targeted for certain kinds of scrutiny, um, and it could mean a number of other things, which I'm going to invite you to think about what some other things might be. So if we look at the intersections, when we look at whiteness, if we look at the intersections, we see certain kinds of things. And when we look at the different layers of power and privilege and domination, what I often say that, people are actually casualties of war. So it's not a coincidence that you had some of the readings that you did this week. So um, if we consider then how whiteness is perpetuated in situations of war, we see that militaristically, there are very few people that actually benefits from war, and there are an awful lot of people that are hurt, and an awful lot more that are killed, depending on what war it is. If you think about, some of the wars that's going on around the world right now, I think I forget, somebody had just said that there's over 87 wars that's going on in the world right now in different parts of the world. I'm not sure where those numbers came from. But you've been privy to some of the wars that's ongoing in different parts of the world. And if you consider who benefits from those wars, it's people that are sitting in white supremacist organizations and positions, and that are actually having the privilege of white supremacist or whiteness behind them that'll enable them to benefit. So if you consider the people that are selling the ammunitions, the companies that are selling the ammunitions, um, the guns and the bullets and the Molotov cocktail and the kind of things that are blowing people up and destroying entire neighborhoods and destroying entire parts of countries, you begin to see that there are very few people that actually benefits from this. And is there a different way to do this? And why don't we do it a different way? So if we consider how people become casualties, just think about women. Women, for example, are used as objects, sexual objects, and as one of your article talks about, they're sexually violated in some particular kinds of ways where you know uh, their body parts um, are assaulted. They personally are assaulted. They are forced to watch their children um, get raped or killed. The husbands or male partners' husbands are forced to watch their wives and their daughters get sexually violated, raped, and women's bodies are used in particular kinds of ways. Young girls are stolen from their parents and they're used as wives, child brides, sex slaves, and this is actually quite detrimental for women and young girls because when and if they return home, they are shunned from their village for the most part. I think it's getting a little better in some cases, but they're shunned from their villages because they have been away with these warlords or criminals. But the thing to remember is that men specifically use sexual violence against women. So, um, with the sexual assault or the rape of women, that is a particular kind of violence that is unknown for the most part to men. And it's also known to young women. If you consider then then you might wonder how is whiteness perpetuated in this case is that you always think who is benefiting from all of this, and it is not a coincidence that women and young girls' bodies are used as pawns um, and sometimes weapons in these fights with the men fighting against each other. They're not raping each other, they're raping the women. And so that's why there's a whole literature around women who are violated sexually um, in military conflicts. So just to get back to how is this perpetuating whiteness, if you consider, as I was saying before, who actually is benefiting from all of this, and if you look at all the wars around the world, then you see which countries are actually having wars, and you begin to see that for the most part it's racialized people um, that are implicated in these wars. I mean, it's racialized people that are involved in these wars, but these wars are not coming naturally because people just want to naturally fight. um, they're actually fighting. These different groups in these different regions are actually fighting amongst each other or against or between each other because of, you know, um, interference from colonial powers and from imperialist powers like the United States and Britain in particular. And now we have China, which is a rising superpower, if I would say a superpower at the moment, that's mingling in all of this, which is making it complicated in terms of seeing how whiteness is perpetuated. Um, when you look at people of different sexual orientation, if you consider how in the military, people of different sexual orientation are forced to hide their identities. And sorry, I keep forgetting that I'm recording this. People are forced to hide their identity, and in the United States there was that "don't ask, don't tell" piece of legislation that President Barack Obama eventually got rid of, where basically people with different sexual orientation, uh, in theory, and on policy, on the books, in terms of policy, they can, they're supposed to be safe, but we know differently. Um, but again, the idea of people of different sexual identities suggests that they're traitor to their gender. So, specifically, men are traitors the the male population, and there's usually lots of talks around um, around procreation and what that means if men are loving men. And generally speaking, people don't think of it as men loving men, they think of men having sex with men, which is another terminology that I can get into at a different time. um, I want to just turn my attention now to child soldiers. When we think about war and how whiteness is perpetuated there, is that these children, if you consider how we think of children, at least in this at this time, how we think of children, we think that children are reverend, they're to be taken care of, they're to be protected, in certainly in North American parts of Europe. And if they're not protected, we think that there is an issue. That's why we have child welfare agencies that take care of children when their parents are not able to take care of them. But what is happening then with the world knowing that they're children of war, child soldiers, mostly young boys, um, that are being forced into killing other young children, and killing, people they know in their neighborhoods, their friends, and those kinds of things. And here we go back to, mostly it's not young white children um, that are placed in these positions. And why is it that the world is unable to do anything? Is because if you consider the warlords are getting the ammunitions from somewhere, they're not just picking it up. Um, and for the most part, some of them are not able to buy the ammunition. So you need to remember that people are actually donating these things to them. So there are a number of ways that children are forced into wars by imperialist ideas and ideologies of whiteness. So what I want to bring your attention back to is how black and brown bodies are disposable. When I say black and brown, I don't just mean people from the United States or parts of Africa. I mean, anybody that does not, that we do not identify as being white. So those are things to consider. And those child soldiers, um, they're in a particular kind of situation because they're children and they're being forced to take up arms, and sometimes they've been forced to kill their own families and parents and siblings and friends and community people, and they live with those demons. And if they're able to get out of it, it just means that there's a whole other side of this war game that we actually don't see and don't know about, and those children are not really properly cared for, and because we really don't know how to care for them for the most part. And if they happen to migrate or immigrate to parts of North America or Europe, or say, let's say Canada, we really don't know how to deal with them. And if you just think about, if a child soldier or a group of child soldiers end up in Newfoundland, in St. John's, Newfoundland, how would we care for them emotionally and mentally? We don't know, right? And then if you consider when they come here and they act out because they've had these violent experiences, we sometimes basically throw them under the bus or throw them to the wolves, by saying that they're just bad kids without recognizing what their background is. Um, so I want to just talk a little bit about who I talked about who profits already. So I want to talk about who is who is implicated really, and why are we all complicit? Because we are all complicit in this, right? You and I and everyone else is complicit. We all know that children are being thrown, into war to kill themselves and each other. We know that women are being raped and sexually violated. We know that sometimes men are assaulted or abused in different kinds of ways. And we know that entire communities turn on each other for lots of different reasons. In the case of the Hutu and the Tutsis, that in that kind of massacre that was influenced by Belgium's historical presence in that part of the world, and created all kinds of divisions with their colonial rules and practices that ensured that people hated each other, even though, if you looked at them, for the most part, you couldn't tell that there were different groups of people. So I want you to consider how we are implicated in all of this. You and I and social workers and your family and friends and people around you, how are we implicated in this? And why are we complicit with any of this? I'm not doing any activist work, around women that are sexually violated. I know very few people who are. I know a few people, but I'm not sure that anyone in the class, and nor any of our two classes, is doing any of that kind of work. And so those are the questions we need to ask ourselves, because, we can sit in class and talk about social justice all we want, but if we're not doing anything, nothing will ever change. So children will be put out to war, women will be sexually violated, whiteness will continue to be perpetuated in the same way, and nothing will ever change. So just to end, I'm going to invite you to watch this second video clip. It's the Racism Project, I think that one's called, and or the Whiteness Project, sorry. And um, and then feel free to explore on the internet. There are several clips out there about the project and how it works and how it came about. And then, you can have that for some background information when we get ready to talk. The other thing I'd like for you to consider, so that when you come you don't have to start thinking about that, is that how do we as social workers actually practice with, vulnerable communities, or communities that are considered um, communities that are considered uh, disadvantaged? How do we work with them when we're feeling um, tensions or ashamed or let down in some kind of way? Because the thing is, most of you will end up working in child welfare agencies. A few of you won't, but most people will end up working with vulnerable people. And so we need to begin to develop the skills to determine how we're going to work with people when we're not feeling so happy, and when there are tensions inherent in the relationships. So I'm going to sign off now. I think that's a long time for anyone to sit and listen to any one person talk. I don't think I've ever talked for this long in any lecture in a very long time, probably never, and it'll probably never happen again. I'll have to find a way to do this slightly differently. Um, so I'm signing off, and I will see you tomorrow. No, I'll see you on Thursday. Bye for now.